Good morning, everyone, and I hope we've all had a good night's rest so that we're bright and awake to listen to this very special plenary session, which is going to talk about the works and contribution of our very special friend, Professor Chua Beng, and the plenary is entitled Chua Beng on Power, Politics, and Pop Culture. Our three speakers for the day will be going through his contributions, through his interventions. I would like to add a personal word of appreciation for the intervention that he has made and the way he has, as far as my association with him is concerned, steered IACS forward, especially the journal. So with respect and appreciation to Professor Beng, I now invite Professor Meaghan Morris, Chair of the Inter-Asia Cultural Societies and Professor of Gender and Cultural Studies of the University of Sydney in Australia.
Thank you, Firdous, and thank you everybody for arriving so early after an eventful day yesterday. My contribution to this panel actually has a title. It's called Doing Cultural Studies Beyond the Culture Industry. I want to link my contribution to the conference in an explicit way to begin, because I myself will not be speaking directly to the theme of pop culture if what we or you understand by that is Chua Beng Huat's justifiably influential recent work on East Asian popular culture and pop culture in East Asia and indeed in other regions of Asia. Now, in Western English and in Singapore, we really must underline the regional nature of Western English. There are other authoritative and official kinds of English. But in Western English, broadly speaking, there is and has long been a productively blurry relationship between pop culture and popular culture. By pop culture, when we speak in the vernacular, people tend to be designating issues about the circulation of commodities. These commodities are often disposable or of a relatively short lifespan, and they have a very high-speed turnover. The speed in the digital age has become such that, in fact, I think what pop culture popularly means now is something more like an endless plenitude of possibilities that's in stasis. I mean, there is a point where the speed reaches such an intensity that it's not meaningful anymore to talk about speed itself. On the other hand, the term popular is still very actively used to designate the function in the present of an older concept of the people's culture, culture located in a grounded community, which these days isn't necessarily grounded in physical space, but nonetheless has a certain kind of durability. And the popular can involve, although it obviously doesn't in many theories, such as that of Michel Sartre, but the popular can popularly designate a cumulative temporality of long duration. Now, those of us who come from liberal democracies and who enjoy the benefits of rational, instrumental, social forms of organisation are quite fond of deconstructing the kind of usage that I have just outlined, which shows our complicity with reason, because we continue to believe that rationally showing that these ideas are mistaken will make them go away. It never does. the definitions I just outlined are extraordinarily durable, and you can see them in the newspaper every day. Now, the relationship between pop culture and popular culture in these vernacular senses is, I think, of vital importance in post-colonial nations, where the combination of lived historical experiences of break and shock and of hybrid temporality that emerges from things lingering, things surviving, things being renewed, is combined every day with an often much higher speed of bombardment of the pop than is experienced in what are now relatively slowly developing sectors, such as the United States and even more slow Australia. Post-colonial nations are born with this hybridity of temporality and the lived experience of dealing with it. Consequently, change and the management of change, and here is where power and politics immediately comes into the field. The problem of managing change poses itself at multiple levels of possible activity, amongst which is that of government imagination, government creativity, and government practice. I've, in parentheses, argued at great length in a book called Too Soon, Too Late that this is true also of Australia. That book is a study of creativity as practiced by shopping mall developers and the Hawke Keating government in the 1980s. Now, Chua Beng Huat's work is many-faceted, and I would take my entire 20 minutes here to just describe some of its features. He's written about port cities and continues to do that sort of research. But across a great deal of his work, this issue of the relationship between the pop and the popular, a relationship always saturated and framed by very serious practical issues of power and politics, continues to recur. I think it is a recurring theme in his work, whether or not it is explicit in a particular piece of writing. For example, many of you will know his book, Life is Not Complete Without Shopping, but not all of you may have read his major, very big book on the Golden Mile, the study of the real estate thinking, the development politics and the architecture that created Singapore's now legendary shopping and finance centre. The combination of these issues is also to be seen in the collaborative work that was done out of ARI, I think, on elections as popular culture. So all of these aspects inform the thinking through of the relationship between pop and popular in a lot of Chua Beng Huat's work. Now, why do I care? Why am I interested? I've been saddled for years with an obligation to write a book called Banality in Cultural Studies. I have never been able to imagine how I would write a book under that title until very recently when I decided to write my book. I'm at the age where I think I have a dreary obligation to contribute to the literature on what is cultural studies or what should cultural studies be, what could cultural studies become. I want to look at the relationship between textual, so-called textual traditions of scholarship. I prefer the term aesthetic. The relationship between aesthetic knowledges and the anthropological, sociological traditions that inform a lot of the most exciting contemporary research. And how both of those traditions of scholarship can come to bear, critically or otherwise, in the field of thinking about policy and government. Consequently, I want to organise this book around the work of people who think in interesting ways about common sense. Who think of common sense as a knowledge. Who work on popular theorising, as well as theories of the popular, and who work with open eyes and steely determination to examine empirically the problems of popular resistance to change, and particularly the kinds of change that intellectuals such as myself might like to see. Beng Huat's work then is absolutely central to this project. And I'm now, in the rest of my time, going to just look at two things. One, a footnote in an essay that he published in 1979, and then briefly, if I get there, an essay from the early 90s on tampons. It seems outrageous to mention Beng Huat in the context of textual scholarship, or it may to those of you who only know his recent work or who have been shouted at for only looking at the TV text. However, Beng Huat was for many years a practitioner of a kind of textual analysis, and during this period he was also a practitioner of Canadian studies. He studied at York University in Toronto from 1970, and after getting his degrees, he taught for several years at Trent University in Ontario, and during this period he worked on Canada. He trained, though, in ethnomethodology, or he practiced ethnomethodology, which is an often forgotten influence on major strands of North American cultural studies, along with, I think more significantly in the North American case, in the US case, symbolic interactionism. And ethnomethodology was also a very strong influence on some Australian cultural studies, particularly the work of Tom O'Regan. Briefly, it's the study of people's methods for ordering activities. Sometimes it's weakly put as making sense of their lives. Someone like Larry Grossberg would use that expression. But I think much more powerfully, it's about ordering and assembling livable, intelligible, practical reality. It's about doing, as Beng Huat was emphasising to me the other day. So that long before many of us popularly talked about doing gender, ethnomethodologists, and Beng Huat in particular, were talking about doing eating, doing shopping, but also about doing democracy. And in the case of his PhD work, subsequently published in several articles, doing royal commissions, something that Australians should be very interested in. Doing national crises, something that perhaps Indonesians know more about than anybody else. He has a wonderful article, which I can't discuss, called Democracy as Textual Accomplishment. And my task is going to be to think about, from my position as essentially a rhetorician, to look at what happens to the textual in that proposition. But the footnote I want to foreground comes from an essay published in 1979 called Describing a National Crisis, an Exploration in Textual Analysis. And it's a study of the 1965 Canadian Royal Commission on Bilingualism and Biculturalism. Very briefly, Beng Huat treats this report as a documentary reality which embodies a textually constructed reality, in this case, a national crisis. And he shows very clearly how the Royal Commissioners establish the reality of the crisis, which they are then enabled to address, in part by completely marginalising all of those interviewees who say, crisis? What crisis? We get on fine. So he looks at how the text works to create as well as legitimate a crisis around bilingualism and biculturalism. Now, in the course of this analysis, there comes an amazing footnote. The footnote says, Schutz, 1970, characterised commonsensical knowledge as ill-organised, often incoherent and inconsistent. This, I interpret as meaning that commonsensical knowledge is formulated non-definitively and solidified only in the process of usage. This is an outrageous paraphrase, which completely transforms the sense of intended by the person who is quoted, who is dismissing commonsensical knowledge. Beng reinterprets it as processual. Commonsensical knowledge is formulated non-definitively. It doesn't come to an end. And it is solidified only in the process of usage. So that the whole kind of problem of agency, of collective contestation, of individual aberration is posed in this moment. Now, a whole cultural studies opens up, I think, in this footnote. I could talk, if there was more time, about the essays in which a kind of limit of usefulness for ethno-methodology alone is reached in his work. His very substantial essays on ethno-methodology and Marxism, on Foucault, particularly the Foucault of the archaeology of knowledge, and how the sort of language revolution of the 70s and 80s, which he and I both lived through, transforms the problematic of sociology. But I'll just indicate that and move on. Now, in 1984, Beng returned to Singapore as Director of Research, not in the university, but for the Housing and Development Board of Singapore. Working directly on the interface of research with, I think, the sort of latter stages of one of the world's most massive, effective and consequential projects of social engineering, which was that of rehousing almost the entire population of Singapore in less than 30 years. To go from what was commonly stereotyped as the worst slum in Asia to what is truthfully describable as the best public housing system in the world. This is an international audience, so I would say, as myself an outsider, if you have some curiosity about some of the urban problems of urban squalor in parts of Singapore that I'm not going to show you a picture of in the moment, please do go to the Chinatown Heritage Museum in Chinatown, where you will see, you begin with pictures of the famines in Fujian that brought many people here, and there is a reconstruction of what was standard housing in Chinatown before this massive project of rehousing began. But in the early 1990s, after he had an eventful year with the Housing Board and Development Board, it didn't last, but I feel that's not my story to tell. He then went to NUS in 1985, and in the early 90s he writes a couple of texts, one of them very long and very interesting, which involve ethnographic studies of relocated residents. Residents from kampung or sometimes rural, also urban villages. These are just pictures for those of you who don't know what a kampung looked like. I suspect these are rural ones, are they? So they're relatively more comfortable, less crowded and less sort of sanitationally challenged perhaps than a lot of the urban kampung. But this is the idea. He had personal lived connections to the communities that he subsequently studied, talking to residents, talking about their life before and their life after they were rehoused in one of the early pioneering housing estates. But this reflective essay, That Imagined Space, Nostalgia for Kampung. First appears in 1991, and then I think in 1993, 94 becomes a now much mythologized essay. And here I'm going to just end by describing the steps in this analysis, which for me are a practical model of doing cultural studies. So perhaps this last part of my talk is addressed to our students and people who are still thinking about what it means to actually do cultural studies. First of all, he traces 3 references to Kampung that appeared in 4 weeks in early 1993. And he describes the collapse that is being effected between the coffee house, or, forgive my pronunciation, kopitiam, the exclusive all-male preserve inside a traditional kampung, with the sort of replicated eating house that you can see now around in the housing estates and elsewhere, which has a very, very different economy, both social and financial. First of all, it's mixed. There's lots of women, there's lots of tourists, and people don't have a sense of community with the same people in a contemporary eating house. And he points out that nonetheless, the kampung has a persistent symbolic significance, and talks a bit in the first page about what that might be. A lot of cultural studies stops right there. It's enough. You know, you find some trace from the past that's being renewed, and you write a whole essay to show that it's being renewed. Submit it to a journal, get refereed. How much? It's being renewed, and you stop. But then he does 3 things, and I'll try to say this in one sentence. Next section is evidence, lived experience. He looks at autobiographies and collective memories and isolates a couple of what we might now call memes about the kampung. One is which is being relaxed and having a sense of community. And he says here, the past is refigured. Now, some cultural studies, a lot of cultural studies, would stop right there. But then he has a little theoretical section on nostalgia. As he said to us the other day, he takes a quite common word and develops it conceptually. And he presents it as an imminent critique of the present. So the interesting thing is not that nostalgia is doing sort of bad ideological work. The question is, what is its positive emotional and political work? And the rest of the essay gives very, very detailed and complex account of the temporality of life in a real kampung and of the pressures of life in contemporary Singapore, which make nostalgia for that way of living not only very easy to understand, but politically effective. My last slide, therefore, is from a contemporary invocation of the kampung by a group of writers, including our conference organiser, sociologist Daniel Goh, if I'm not mistaken, where people use this nostalgia for the kampung to argue against what is beautifully called Singapore's sudden outbreak of ungraciousness, in other words, xenophobia towards new migrants. And this, to me, is what doing cultural studies means. You have to go beyond the moments of theoretical critique, the moments of feeling superior to the text that you're writing about, and you have to make it work inside a real issue that involves both the pop and the popular in your own world. Thank you.